It's over here.
Hey.
Hey, Morgan.
Oh, I had some notes. Can you bring me my bag over there? Yeah.
Oh, no. I feel like this.
Yeah, I got no, I just have some notes here. I also got us some of these.
Oh,
I thought that would be a good thing to have. Yeah. And then, just for old time's sake, I thought just for the first question, we could put on this Frankenstein mask. It's Boris Karloff's Frankenstein, just for the first question.
It is Burrow.
Yeah, but this is a callback to 2006.
I'm going to do it this way so I can.
Yeah, this is good. All right, so we'll both wear these just for the first question. All right, so Eric.
Yes.
You do a lot of stuff.
Yeah.
Now, when you're on say a train, and a business person is on the train sitting next to you, and you're in for a long ride with them, and they're like, "So what do you do?" How do you answer that question?
I try to avoid it.
Great. You try to avoid, and then they press, and so what do you say? How do you explain what your job is?
Well, it's funny because I used to always be like, oh, I don't like being called an artist because it's such a weird loaded term and it separates out like a class of people who make things from like other people who make things for other reasons. But I've come to just resign myself to the fact that it's probably the most convenient label. So that's probably what I say.
And then
I say I make art. Actually, I don't say I'm an artist. I say I make art.
And they push further, and they're like, "Well, so what's your medium? How do you answer that question?"
I cut things out of paper. I like to say sometimes I cut pieces of paper into smaller pieces of paper.
So you're a collage artist?
No. Printmaker, I say that one. I usually just list a bunch of things until their eyes glaze over and then we move on. And then I ask them about themselves.
That's fair enough. All right, thank you. We can take the masks off now. That was
this is a callback to public embarrassment.
Yeah, do you want to tell that story? You want to tell that story? You can give that to me.
Thank you.
That's where I got this quote.
We were performing at, what year was that? Black Sheep Puppet Festival?
2006.
2006, right before I moved to Philadelphia, with Morgan, who I had known for years at that point, and he was doing a piece that I didn't realize this was a plant in the audience. He was doing a piece called The Frankenstein of Everyday Life.
That's true.
A mashup of Van Heim and Shelley, and like he was like, oh, I was there with my friend Christy Turnus, who was my assistant puppeteer at the time, and he was like, oh, I left something in the audience, and they had broken down on the way, and so I was like, oh, he's frazzled, he left something in the audience, and then I went to go, and Christy was going to get it. I was like, oh, I'll get it, trying to be generous or whatever, and then I got suckered into having a Frankenstein mask being put on me and being stuck on stage for the rest of the show.
He was the star of the show, Erik Ruin. You were on a train in that one. You were Frankenstein's monster on a train. Yeah.
I was deeply uncomfortable the entire time.
Yeah. Let's go back. You are from Detroit originally.
From just outside Detroit, yeah.
Right. There's the old cliche, you can take the kid out of Detroit, but you can't take Detroit out of the kid. So Eric, what makes you a Michigander? You lived in Philly for a while, you lived in a lot of other places, but what about you? You're like, hey, what can I say? I'm from Michigan. This is the way that I see the world.
I'm not aggressive in traffic. I mean, as far as to like Philadelphians. I think like for me, like there's a certain Midwestern thing where it's like not being pushy with oneself and like being a little self-effacing. I don't know that I live up to these things. I felt like I was like a very East Coast Midwesterner, and then I moved to the East Coast and I was like, oh, I'm a Midwesterner.
What do you call that stuff you're drinking right there?
I mean, pop, yeah.
Yeah, pop. Okay, so that's completely Michigander.
Yeah.
So Detroit is a city with a tremendous cultural scene. A lot of great art and music come from that city. What were some things growing up in the Detroit area that were like, oh my gosh, this is from here and I'm connected to it? What are some formative arts, music experiences for you in being a Michigander, as you are?
I mean, like literally, I was telling Jesse this in the car right here. I was like, my dad sang me the MC5 in the cradle, like literally would sing me very inappropriately the song Human Being Lawnmower, which is about student protesters being machine gunned. But he liked the part where they go, cha 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 cha. And so he would sing that to me as an infant. So like that for me is like the birth of punk rock, all that early great rock and roll. I mean, like Motown, but that doesn't feel like my culture as much, you know? But like, you know, the MC5 and the Stooges for sure are big ones.
What about art? There's lots of great art in Detroit.
Yeah.
Were there like formative art experiences for you growing up in the Detroit area?
I'm trying to think. I mean, like growing up, like for me, like there was stuff like the Heidelberg Project and Tyree Guyton and all that stuff that was local, and there's a great kind of black abstract expressionist-ish movement in the Cass Corridor where I lived for a long time. But for me, probably actually the biggest impact is like a local art experience growing up that I still think about like almost every day, was growing up and going to the Detroit Institute of the Arts, where they have this amazing courtyard where there's the Diego Rivera murals. And there's in particular, and I was, saw that since I was a very small child, and that had a huge impact on the way I think about, especially the construction of narrative. At one point I did like a real study of it and was like, oh, this because there was an existing architecture of that courtyard that had like different sections that corresponded in kind of a grid. So there'd be like a vaccination scene and a scene of the that referenced the Annunciation, some other scene like that corresponded to it, a scene of birds in flight, a scene of planes in flight that were juxtaposed, and then they would be corresponding to pieces across there. And so for me, that like this concept of like a juxtapositional narrative, that you create a narrative like by constellating different discrete moments in time or discrete scenes or tableau, and the way that we draw a linkage between those things is what creates a narrative out of them. Like I think about that like every time I make something.
This whole story when you go into that courtyard and you're in this room surrounded by this huge Rivera mural, and it has a narrative impact to it, which we're getting ahead of ourselves now. When did you realize that like art was a thing that you wanted to do? Notice I'm not saying when did you decide to be an artist, because he doesn't like to say that he's an artist, but that he's a person who makes art.
Resigned to be.
So you're resigned to be an artist. But when did you realize that like art? Yeah, I want to do this. This is what I want to do. How?
I mean, I think some form of creative expression was always very interesting to me. Like when I was like a little kid, I was like a very precocious child because I just my mother would lock me out of the house because I would just read constantly. And so like, I remember when I was 12, people would be like, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I was like, I want to be a novelist, like Dostoevsky. Like, and that was my reference point. I really wanted to be Dostoevsky because I had read Crime and Punishment and Notes from the Underground. I was like, oh, that's me. I'm Raskolnikov.
How old?
Like 12.
12, okay.
That was a very dark temper.
Show of hands, who's read that book? Who's like actually read the book? No shame. All right. Okay. You're in good company.
Yeah.
Notice my hand did not go up, but please.
Best book ever. So.
Okay. All right.
It's a weird model for a 12-year-old,
yes.
though, you know?
So novelist, and then what was your
your
fallback career? Not everyone gets to do that.
I think it was to be a painter. Or no, I was going to be a professor, which is funny because I never went to college. But I would wear like an Oxford sweatshirt. I was also weirdly an Anglophile as a small child, and so I was a weird kid. And they would either call me Hey Oxford, or my family would call me the absent-minded professor because I've always been very absent-minded. That was like my nickname as a little kid. Yeah.
All right. So you've talked about like wanting to do art. When are you crossing this threshold into making art and being an artist, maybe in a community of artists?
Yeah, I mean, right, like, I mean, the real thing is, like, there's some aspect of which we all draw when we're kids, and then some of us stop, and some of us just keep going, you know? And I never, I think there was, a certain point where I had been writing, and I wrote all this really angsty, terrible poetry, and, made weird collage art, and I, put out a zine when I was in high school.
What was it called?
My best friend, 00 Empty Sky.
00
Which was
Empty
named
Sky.
after a legendary Pink Dot song, if anyone knows them. And I was obsessed with weird music and art and stuff. But I think in terms of visual art, somewhere in my teens, I went through some kind of dark experiences and stopped being able to write. And then I took up, and I'd done some visual art, but then I really took up painting and made these really terrible, angsty, abstract expressionist paintings, probably starting in high school. And that was that. But then for a long time, into my 20s, I would make art, but it was always an extension of a lifestyle or an extension of my political work or whatever. I would make collages and stencils and put them up in the street. But I wasn't consciously thinking of myself as an artist. It was a way of participating in the culture, like the DIY culture or the activist culture. It wasn't like, I was like, this is what I'm gonna do, it's gonna be my living, this is like my purpose in life. It was very much like just a part of like being like some of my friends were in bands. I have no sense of rhythm, so I couldn't be in a band. I'll make the flyer, or I'll make some other art that I can put out, you know.
Did you find there was a moment where you were just doing this stuff, and then a moment where people started to ask you, started to come to you and be like, oh, our band is playing a show, can you make a flyer?
You know, I don't remember like a central turning point. I think honestly one of the big ones, which is a funny story that involves you, like, like, you know, I think I always just did things under my own steam for a long time, and it was like, some people would like it or something, and sometimes we'd get asked to do like I started doing these shadow puppet shows that were like an episodic history of people's history of Detroit called Rust and Riot with my old partner Beck Young. You know, but like, and I would make flyers for punk shows at the house that I lived at, because I lived in a collective house in Detroit that had a lot of shows and stuff. But I was kind of doing it on my own, and I think the real point that like people started like, the first time I remember getting paid to make something for someone else in a significant way was actually, I came here with this really over-the-top show called The Other 9/11 that we had constructed shortly after 9/11 that was telling the story of the coup in Chile, which also happened on September 11th in the 70s. I have terrible dates, I think. Early, yeah. And you know, it was like we, you know, had an overhead projection drawing of Pinochet's face that we dripped blood on, while my friend played metal percussion and screamed Eduardo Galeano text. You know, it was like very black and white in a particular way. And I had made all these stencils for that, and I came to do a festival performance here. And I think there was like 5 people there, something like that. It was like
It's not a
that
well-attended
book,
show.
yeah.
Yeah, we lost a lot of money. So.
It was an experiment, you know.
We're still friends.
No experiments.
Yeah.
And then but one of those 5 people was this person, Deb Cheval, who was directing a troupe called the Liberty Cabbage Theater Revival. Is that the right name? Yeah.
That is correct.
And doing this play called an All on a Seder play that was speaking to, you know, Jewish artists speaking to other Jewish folks about issues of Palestine, using the central device of the Passover Seder as a framing device. And she asked me to make these series of stenciled or still shadow scenes based on this 10 plagues of the occupation. And that was the first time anyone was like, actually was like, oh, I want to hire you to make this thing. And then it's funny, because of those 5 people who were in that audience, like then those graphics that I made for that ended up traveling around the world and being used for different things. And it was like my first experience of actually feeling like, oh, people care about this. This is something that like is a useful thing to be doing in the world in a particular way.
So let's back up a second. You said you were doing a shadow puppet show.
Yeah.
That's a weird thing to do. How'd you get into that? What's that all about?
There was a brief phase in the late 90s where people, or early zeros, were calling themselves puppetistas. This guy.
Portmanteau, puppeteer, and Zapatista. Yeah.
You know, and like, you know, like doing that as a form of like an activist performance, usually happening in the same venues as like punk bands or stuff like that, or like, you know, traveling to DIY circuits. And I was like, that looks like fun. I want to do that. And I like knew I was better at drawing than I was at like singing or playing drums or whatever. So I was like, this is my way of participating in the culture. And it kind of like was very organic, where like I was making stencils, but I realized I liked it better when it was a white image on black than a dark image on a light surface, which means it's like in a stencil, like your lines have to float apart if you're making a dark image on black, but if you're making a light image on white, you can do like a single line drawing, cut that out, and then spray paint it. And I was like, people kept being like, oh, those look like shadow puppets or paper cuts. And I was like, oh, yeah, that's an idea. So I started doing that. And then I was also like, I had seen this guy, Bo, do like a really weird shadow puppet show, like in a bed sheet that was stretched across the door of a bedroom adjoining a living room where there was a show in between bands. And I was like, I want to do that. I want to do what that guy's doing, you know? And that's kind of how I got into it. Yeah.
So you never went to college.
Yeah.
But, you know, you're
I
self-educated.
barely graduated high school,
I know that you did an internship for the Bread and Puppet Theater
yeah.
for a summer.
Yeah, in 2002.
You want to talk about that a little bit and what
Sure, that
what
was
that's
like,
all about and how that affected you. And
yeah, that was a real crucial time because it was also like, not to get too like personal, but it was right after my father had passed away. And so I was just kind of like a weird hot mess and like, am I?
no, it's not
I'm
you.
doing something. No, it's me. It is me.
I don't think it's you.
That's better.
Yeah, I think it's the way I'm holding the microphone.
It's like the MC5 effects over here.
It's more like the Merzbow effect, you know, or very subtle noise music. The Jessica Rowland effect. What was the question? Bread and puppet. Oh yeah. So I was just like a mess, and I was like, please just tell me what to do. And I had gotten accepted for a full scholarship to do this internship in bread and puppet. I'd already been doing shadow puppets for a couple of years at that point, and I knew some of the folks who had been involved in the company, and I was always heard these amazing things about this experience of going out like in the middle of on an old farmhouse in a barn or like in a field in Vermont and doing these like radical political puppet shows. And I don't know, I learned so much from that experience, even though it's like basically you go out there and you like wiggle some cardboard around and a really, you know, intense old German guy yells at you if you're doing it well or badly, you know, and you're just like, no, not that, yes, okay, you know, and you're like, but like there's some things that like, I really like tickle, like there was like one point I was like moving something, he's like, you know, if an image is beautiful enough, like I think about this all the time, if an image is beautiful enough, people want to look at it. And since then, I've really like thought about that a lot and been like, oh, like what I feel like I do now is like, I'm giving an image context and duration. Like I don't see myself as much as like a puppeteer these days because I'm not like articulating figures and I'm not concerned with like character or anything like that. I'm really like giving images context and duration.
Yeah, and I mean, this is part of why I asked the like hypothetical business person on the train question, because I've been asked that question too. And when you say like anything about puppetry, they automatically assume that it's like Kermit the Frog or Punch and Judy kind of thing.
Or they'll do the fun thing like, oh, you do shadow puppetry. They're like, I only know the rabbit, you know.
Right. Exactly. Yeah, and a thing that I had a revelation. Sorry, one of those words. Going to Bread and Puppet was understanding that form of puppetry it's like art that's given a duration, right? You go to a museum and you decide, okay, how long am I going to look at Whistler's Mother, and how long am I going to look at this Rothko, and you decide. But when you sit in a theater and you're shown images, and those images are telling a story, and the artist is basically deciding, you know, it's a different kind of thing. And I mean, there are words for it. It's a tradition that's very old in a lot of different languages, and so I think we should just talk about the piece that you're going to do tonight, which is Long Gone.
Sure. You don't want to ask that question yet about music?
We talked about music.
Just look in here.
We talked about music. Long Gone. Why don't you talk about how you made the piece?
Yeah, this is good because this will take care of all the questions people ask me after the show. So my good friend Azamina Kramos, who probably many of you know, had done like a dance performance. I forget what museum, it was like a regional museum. And somehow there was some industrial stuff that happened there at some point. Sorry, I'm garbling this, but like, and they had these giant spindles of paper that were like 5 inches tall, but like very thick. And they had been using them. It was this, what was the name of that site-specific dance company that she was in? I forget. They did a thing at Grounds for Sculpture. They've done it, but they were pretty active for a minute there. Anyways, they were using these paper in the performance, and she was like, oh, I saved you a roll from this thing. I figured you would want it. You do stuff with paper. And I was like, oh, what do I do with this? Because it's like, you know, barely thicker than a toilet paper roll. And I was like, I don't know what to do with like something that small. And I was like, you know, I'm just going to start cutting it out. And then after a while, I was like, oh, this would be like a shadow cranky. It's like a thing you can scroll across a projector.
You just use some jargon. What does this mean? Not everyone's a shadow puppeteer.
A cranky.
What is this?
A cranky is a term that Peter Schiven from Bread and Puppet, I believe, coined for a very old form that exists in lots of different forms that Morgan has written articles about.
In Indonesia, it's called wayang baber, which is scrolling shadows. They use the word shadow to describe anything that is related to puppetry, not because puppetry is always literally a shadow, but because the puppet is like the shadow of the real thing, right? You have a doll, and that's like a shadow of the thing that the doll is depicting. And they also use the word wayang to talk about film, right? So like the idea of scrolling shadows is a precursor to film. which is just scrolling shadows. We've just put them into frames and made the light flicker so that we see it. So anyway, I'm getting ahead of myself. But why don't you talk about what you're doing here?
You know, so like I had seen people do these crankies, and I saw somebody, I can't remember, do like one that like scrolled over and over a projector, so there was a context for it. So cranky just means a scrolling picture show, basically, right? Or in the Victorian era, they called them moving panoramas. And sometimes, like when I first started doing them, there were backgrounds for characters that would move around or stay still, and they would be move through the landscape. And I was like, you know, I don't care about the figure, I care about the landscape. Or I care about the way the landscape and the figure interact, but not in a way that like I'm prioritizing the figure. So I just took the figure out and was like, all right, we'll do the landscape. Yeah, and so in terms of making this thing, there's a very specific conceit to it, which is that I really gave myself the brief that I was never going to draw more than a foot ahead. So the total piece of paper is 100 feet long, which is just a long section of one section of a much longer piece of paper. So I've sometimes threatened to like reattach it and make it 200 feet, but I don't have the kind of time anymore. Yeah, so I was like, oh, I will let each image suggest the next image. So there's no coherent narrative or overarching thing, though many people have suggested them to me, and including some that have been really right on, but I probably don't want to say that before the show to like lead you on too much or like give you specific ideas too much. But there's like, you know, things from my personal life. There's a big depiction of my old cat in there. There's some scenes I saw with friends. There's also a bunch of stuff from classical literature. But it was really like, you know, here's all these birds. Where do they go? What do those shapes suggest? So really trying to like surprise myself in a way that hopefully keeps it fresh for other people.
I've seen a lot of your work.
Yes.
Yeah, and I noticed some recurring themes, certain like themes of tone, but also a lot of visual themes. And I'm just going to name some things, and you can just talk about them.
Okay.
All right?
I don't want
It's a drink now. All right. Just pop.
It's a good thought.
Ocean waves.
Yes. You know, there's a funny story about that. Like, so since I'm self-taught as an artist, like, I kind of would just give myself assignments because, like, for years I didn't know how to do water in a way that was interesting. I would just be like a wash of color, or like, but in terms of thinking about shadow puppets in black and white, I didn't like the way I was doing them. So I would just go and I had a little folding chair, and I would go and bike down to the Detroit River behind the post office and sit there and just draw waves. And I just did that for a long time until I hit upon this particular way of doing it. And then I kind of became addicted to it.
I never knew that.
Yeah.
Glad I asked.
Yeah.
Clouds?
I mean, you know, I don't know if there's a particular thought behind it. I mean, you know, my band is called the Ominous Cloud Ensemble.
Oh, talk about your band. We didn't talk about your band. So what is it with you and clouds? You see clouds in your work. Your band is named after a cloud or an ensemble of clouds.
Yeah, you know.
What's going on with the clouds, Eric?
I don't. It's not a conscious thing necessarily. If I had to like free associate, you know, it'd be like, I mean, I'm interested in weather patterns. Always been like really attracted to storms. I have these like really fond memories of like I have a tattoo of a tornado here that's based in like growing up, like there would be a tornado season every year, and like this like moment of charged latent energy where the sky would go bottle green and everything would be like the most charged kind of stillness, and like that's a really firm memory from my childhood. And then we'd go hide in the basement, you know, like so there's that. There's like the idea of things. I've always thought a lot about like the ways things are obscured, right? Like the way things pass behind clouds, or the way things like dissolve or mutate or transform. I'm really addicted to like showing things in the state of transformation, you know, because I think that's somewhat a little bit encouraging, even though my work isn't particularly encouraging. But yeah, the idea of like things getting lost or drifting away or obscured by something else is very powerful. Clouds are maybe a good metaphor for that. I'm just free associating.
You did the Fire Museum t-shirts that
Yeah.
Stephen displayed for us, and you often have flames
Yeah.
in your work. Yeah, flames, things being burned down.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of it's just me staring at a lot of medieval paintings, and people are in hell, and there's that. There's also just, you know, growing up, there definitely maybe, again, this is total free association. None of these things are conscious. But like, I think the first thing I think about too is like in growing up in Detroit, you know, in the 80s in particular, in the 70s, 80s, there was a lot of fires downtown. There was a thing called Devil's Night, which was the night before Halloween, and all these buildings would go up all the time. And a lot of people will be like, oh, it's the lawless heathens of the inner city. And like, similarly to New York, a lot of it was landlord arson, people trying to recoup insurance money, So I think about that a lot, and that was like always a thing that was in my head of like this myth of these fires. And I grew up in like in a kind of inner ring, like white working class suburb of Detroit, which is one of the places people like my grandparents went, like when they were fleeing during the process of white flight from the inner city, which definitely my family is part of the legacy of. And so, we had all these like scary stories people would tell about the inner city, And so maybe it's part of that was like a charged image in my head.
Trees, particularly leafless trees.
I love just the way its branches intersect. And I've always just loved, there's something like really dramatic about a leafless tree, the way it stands out against the sky in a particular way, Like it's just such a great stark black and white image. And they're just really like, I feel like you can get like real lost in the little intersecting lines. It's like one of my favorite things, but it's also one of the things I'm always cursing myself for doing, because if you're cutting out a tree in negative, you're cutting out all the little spaces between the branches, and it takes fucking forever and it hurts your hands a lot.
Yeah, you mentioned, so many of these things are background elements. You mentioned that you wanted to make work that focuses on background rather than character, and yet there are a lot of human figures in your work, and I feel like you have a very distinctive way of presenting them, I think, because a lot of them are cut from paper, and so you have to make the lines connect. But I associate a lot of faces, a lot of hands with the work that you're making.
Yeah, I don't know. Humans are interesting. I'm a human. I think a lot of my work is to do with like, there's a lot of masses of people, a lot of like crowds. And I think a lot about like that in terms, and it's funny because I've been noticing like in this piece that we're gonna see.
Maybe insects will be his next.
Yeah, I have not done a lot of insects. I leave that to my friend Roger P. But I think at one point I had this conception where I was like, oh, like the individual is monumental. It's a singular. It's an individual experience. Two people is like inherently like it's a dyad. It's like potentially like romantic. It has that sense of like a dialogue between two people. And then like three's a crowd. Three is when it gets interesting. Three is when it becomes social. And so like for a long time I was using three people, and I was like, that's a shortcut. I just need to do the math, right? I need to just spend all the time, cut out all these people. And for a while it was like taking photographs out of old newspapers of crowd scenes and just cutting out each face as a way of like kind of trying to fall in love with everyone at once. Like really for me it's like about like regarding humanity, and a lot of it is an extension of empathy, right? It's like thinking through, like when I'm drawing like a mass of people, I'm like really getting lost in each face and thinking about the relationship to the other faces around them, even though they might become like kind of like the same person after a while in certain ways. Like I'm always thinking about like what the different relationships are in those big masses, and like each one of them I like kind of like have a little like little some amount of love for, It's like coming out of that. Yeah.
It's very nice. Lastly, let us actually look back to musical collaboration. You mentioned earlier that you didn't find being a big fan of music but not having a place in musicality, but wanting to sort of be the member of a band.
Yeah.
So you've done that, and just talk about your different musical collaborations. There have been so many people that you've collaborated with, including one that you're going to collaborate with here tonight.
Yep. Jesse's part of that right there. Which is super fun. Trying to think of even early on, I think I realized I did some early shows, and I remember I took this show on a bike tour across Europe in a little trailer, and I had a little tape that my friend Hot Tony had made of weird noise music, and would do this little show about the evolution of private property that nobody could understand. And then I was but I found every time I something got stuck on something, or something broke down, or the light went out, or I would have to pause the tape and rewind it, And I was like, oh man, if I just had live musicians there, this would be totally different. They could cover for me, and it just felt like a more fluid back and forth relationship, versus asking someone to score something of mine. It becomes fixed, right? And it becomes a little bit of a one-way street. And so I was really interested in what it would be like to improvise with, what it would be like to have somebody who could improvise. And I think one of the more, and I worked with musicians for a long time before I moved to Philly, but like, when I moved to Philly, I developed a close friendship with this person that I'm sure many people, or a number of people here know, Kat Hernandez. He's like a really just breathtakingly brilliant violinist and composer who now lives in Sweden. And we created this wordless shadow puppet show that was made for 2 overhead projectors called Flight, that Kat created. Like, it was, at one point it was an improvised score, and then it kind of settled into, kind of gelled into a roughly scored piece. And I think that was the first time. And then we would also like jam and just like I'd play around with the overhead projector, and she would improvise in response to that, and I would improvise in response to her. And then I developed this practice of improvisation where I was using multiple projectors. If anyone's seen Ominous Cloud, you know what it's about. But thinking of it as like a jazz combo, where like there's like maybe the saxophone is the lead instrument, like so the overhead projector is the lead instrument, but like other people take solos, other people take the lead. Everyone's responding fluidly to one another at once. But it's kind of centered around the image. Because also then there was a period of time where I was like doing projections for weird punk bands and stuff, like Signals and Lesser Known Neutrinos, which is great and fun, but I was always, they had a set thing they were doing and I was improvising in response to them. I was like, this isn't as fun as like it being a two-way street and us feeding off each other's energies.
The piece that we're going to see, I mean, sort of like that, if those bands that have more traditional song structures,
Yeah.
and you've got something that's already cut out of paper,
Yeah.
it's not going to change.
No.
And
Sometimes I speed up.
sometimes you speed up, yeah, but just
Mostly
like
when
a
it
song
hurts,
could be sped
yeah.
up as well.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know.
Yeah, and then
I
there is
make that into a question, but I can't figure out
well, I
how
mean,
to.
what I could say, there is a score to this piece.
Right, there's a score,
that
that's
I,
what I'm
that I
thinking,
wrote with the collaboration of Dan Blacksburg, and I think Quinn Collins was involved. Like, cause we developed this piece, once I had the whole piece finished, the 100 feet, I would do it with Ominous Cloud, with various different versions of Ominous Cloud, because Ominous Cloud is always changing. And I kind of like, we like developed it. I mean, tell me if this is inaccurate, because you were involved in this process. But I feel like we kind of like, people jammed that out, and then I like would pick out parts I liked and be like, oh yeah, I really liked it when you did this like weird discordant thing during that section, and then that kind of created like through the jamming it out, like became like a structure of kind, and then I would kind of conduct it a little bit into being, but obviously it was built around like what people were improvising. And that was nice because it was like a 7-piece band. So I'd be like, oh yeah, kind of let Tara take over for now, and then you can come in with this, and maybe you should drop out there. Obviously they were making those decisions for themselves in a lot of ways, but I was like kind of coaxing it in gradually into shape. And then when I wanted to tour the piece, I was like, oh, it's a lot to bring 7 people on tour. It's not very cost effective. And so I was like, oh, okay, let me create a structure for improvisation built around what we developed collectively. So then I wrote out a score, and it has screenshots from the original video of the piece, and different descriptions of the mood in those pieces, and sometimes suggestions like add rhythm here, rhythm drops out, slows down, and it has 2 metrics. It has a volume metric and a density metric between 1 and 5. And so then that was nice. So the piece, this is maybe an interesting tidbit about this piece. So now I've done the piece in a bunch of different places, and it's nice because it fits in a little tiny box, and I can just borrow a projector in different places and do it with anyone. So the piece, I went out to Portland and did it with this amazing guitar player, Marisa Anderson, and a drummer friend of hers, Janie Black. Did it with, and then I took the piece for my 40th birthday. I was having a very mild midlife crisis and decided to go to Europe, and was like, I'll just take myself on a European tour. And so I did the piece like in a bunch of places in Europe, and each place it was a very different group. So like, basically it was like, if people know Erik Ruin from Primordial Undermine, we did a piece in Vienna together, which was like a full-on raging psych rock band that like scored the entire thing. I did it with a solo cello with Helena Espal in Portugal. One of my favorites is we did a hurdy-gurdy French horn duet in Berlin. Did it with like a saxophone, drums, like sludge metal band, Dead Neanderthals in Holland. Like it was like really, really different approaches to the piece.
Wow.
And it's been fun now. It's like, Jesse and I have done a few times now. One of my last gigs before COVID, I think both our last gigs before COVID, we went to Narrowsburg, New York, and performed up there. And that was the first time I think maybe I'd done it with just, oh wait, no, I don't want with Helena as just one person, but like that was like kind of locked in a particular vibe, and Jesse makes such a diverse array of sounds. I was like, oh yeah, you could do the whole thing.
Let's see it.
Yeah.
And hear
Great.
it. Great. So everybody, Erik Ruin. Justin Steinhoff, now going to perform Long Gone.